Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
When I was around 9 or 10 years old, I had a serious fear of dolls. It was not the kind of fear where I simply disliked them or thought they looked strange. I was truly terrified of them. Even seeing a doll sitting quietly on a shelf could make me uncomfortable. I would imagine its eyes moving when I looked away, or its head slowly turning in my direction. Most of that fear came from watching the Chucky movies when I was much too young. After seeing those films, I could no longer look at dolls as harmless toys. In my mind, they were small, human-shaped things that could come alive when no one was watching. I knew the movies were fictional, and I knew adults would tell me that dolls could not move on their own. But fear does not always listen to logic, especially when you are a child. Because of that fear, I hated sleeping in complete darkness. My bedroom door had to stay open every night, and the light in the hallway had to remain switched on. The hall light was not especially bright, but it was enough to send a soft glow into my room. It lit part of the floor, the edge of my bed, and the doorway. As long as I could see that light, I felt safer. I knew I could look out into the hallway and see that nothing was there. I could also hear my family moving around the house, which reminded me that I was not alone. My room was filled with normal childhood things. There were toys, boxes, clothes, and objects scattered around the floor. During the day, they were harmless. At night, they created strange shapes in the shadows. A pile of clothes could look like someone crouching near the wall. A toy left beside a box could look like a face. The light from the hallway helped me understand what everything was, so I could relax enough to fall asleep. My family knew I needed the hall light. It had become part of our nightly routine. Before everyone went to bed, someone would make sure the light was on and my bedroom door was open. No one thought much about it anymore. It was simply one of those things families do for children who are afraid of the dark. Around that time, my older sister came home to visit us for a week. She had moved away to attend university, so she did not live with us full-time anymore. She was visiting during a break, and I remember being happy that she was home. When she visited, she slept in the spare bedroom down the hallway from mine. There was one piece of clothing she wore so often that I can still picture it clearly. It was a very long, oversized white shirt that she used as pajamas. The shirt had cartoon pictures of famous basketball players printed across it. On the back were the words, "Slam Dunk." It was much too large for her, falling far down her legs, but that was probably why she liked sleeping in it. She wore it for years, even after moving out of our house. It became one of those familiar objects that I always connected with her. The first night she stayed with us, everything seemed completely normal. My mother went to bed, my sister stayed awake a little longer, and eventually the house became quiet. I was sleeping in my room with the door open, just as I always did. The hall light was on, sending its usual glow through the doorway. At some point during the night, I suddenly woke up. I do not know what woke me. I did not remember having a nightmare, and I did not hear a loud sound. One moment I was asleep, and the next I was fully awake, sitting up in bed. The room was quiet. The hall light was still on. That detail has always been important to me because my mother and sister later tried to explain what happened by saying I must have woken in the darkness and become frightened. But I remember clearly that the hallway was lit when I opened my eyes. I could see the light coming through the open doorway. I could see the shapes of the objects in my room. I was not confused, and I was not half asleep. I felt awake. I sat there for a few seconds and listened. The house seemed completely still. I assumed my mother and sister were both sleeping. I moved the blankets aside and slid my legs toward the edge of the bed. I remember thinking that I might go to the kitchen for a drink because I felt thirsty. My feet were nearly on the floor when I heard something in the hallway. It sounded like bare feet walking across the wooden floor. The steps were soft and slow. At first, I was not afraid. I assumed it was my mother or my sister. People sometimes wake during the night to use the bathroom or get water. Since my older sister was staying in the spare room, it made sense that she might be walking down the hall. I stayed sitting on the edge of the bed and looked toward the open doorway. The footsteps came from the left, which was the direction of the spare bedroom. Then something walked into view. At first, my mind recognized my sister. It had her hair. It had her face. It was wearing the exact same long white shirt covered in cartoon basketball players. I could even see the familiar design and the way the oversized material hung down from its small body. But it was not my sister. It was a doll version of her. The thing was only about half the height of my real sister. It had the proportions of a large doll or a very small child, but its appearance copied my sister perfectly. The face looked like hers. The hair was the same. Even the nightshirt was correct, although it was far too large for the small body wearing it. The material almost swallowed the creature, hanging much lower than it did on my actual sister. It moved slowly past my open doorway. I remember staring at it and immediately feeling cold. The fear was so sudden that it seemed to pass through my entire body at once. A second earlier, I had been thinking about getting a drink. Now every muscle in my body locked in place. I wanted to call out for my mother. I wanted to scream. I could not make a sound. The doll did not look like a shadow or a figure created by clothes in the hallway. It was solid and real. The hall light shone on it, and it cast a shadow across the wooden floor. I could hear the soft sound of its bare feet with every step. I could also hear it breathing. The breaths were gentle, but they were clear enough that I knew they were coming from the small figure. It was not moving silently, like something in a dream. It made the quiet sounds a living body would make. It was also humming. I could not understand the tune. It was soft and calm, almost as if the doll were walking through the house without a care in the world. That made it even more frightening. It was not rushing toward me or trying to frighten me. It seemed completely comfortable in our home. The thing did not look directly into my bedroom as it passed, but I felt certain it knew I was watching. I stayed frozen on the bed. I could not understand what I was seeing. Part of my mind kept trying to turn it into my real sister. Maybe she looked smaller because of the angle. Maybe she was crawling or bending down. But the figure was clearly walking upright, and it was far too short. Its body looked like a doll made in the image of my sister. It moved toward the hall light switch. The switch was on the wall outside my room, high enough that the creature could not reach it while standing normally. The doll stopped beneath it. Then it jumped. It reached upward and struck the switch. The hall light went out. The moment the light disappeared, the entire house became pitch black. I could no longer see the doll. I could no longer see the hallway. I could not even see the objects in my own room. That was when my body finally began to move. The fear that had held me frozen suddenly turned into blind panic. I jumped from the bed and ran toward the door. I had no plan beyond closing it before the doll could enter. Because I could not see, I crashed into everything in my path. My legs hit toys and boxes on the floor. I stumbled against objects and nearly fell, but I kept moving. I was certain the doll was coming toward my room through the darkness. I reached the door and slammed it shut. Then I pressed my whole body against it. I was small, but I pushed with all the strength I had. I believed that if I let go, the doll version of my sister would open the door and come inside. I started screaming. I screamed for my mother over and over. I cried so loudly that my throat hurt. My hands shook against the door, and I could barely breathe between the screams. I listened for the doll on the other side. I expected to hear the soft steps approaching. I expected the humming to begin again. Instead, I heard my mother and sister wake up and rush down the hallway. They reached my bedroom door, but they could not open it because I was pushing against it from inside. My mother called my name and told me to move, but I was too frightened to understand that it was her. All I knew was that someone was trying to get through the door. I pushed harder and continued screaming. My mother finally had to force the door open. She pushed from the hallway while I pressed against it from the other side. Eventually, she was able to overpower me and enter the room. My sister turned the lights back on. The sudden brightness hurt my eyes, but seeing my mother and my real sister brought some relief. I was still crying and shaking so badly that I could barely speak. My mother tried to calm me down while my sister looked around the room and hallway. There was nothing there. No doll, no small figure, no sign that anything had walked through the house. Once I could speak, I told them what I had seen. I explained that I had woken up and seen the light on. I had heard bare feet walking along the wooden floor. Then, a doll version of my sister had passed my doorway. I described its small size, its face, its hair, and the oversized white basketball shirt. I told them it looked exactly like my sister, only much shorter. I told them it had a shadow. I told them I could hear it breathing and humming. Finally, I told them that it had jumped up and switched off the hall light. My mother and sister did not know what to say. They assumed I had experienced a nightmare. They thought I had woken up confused and frightened, perhaps believing part of the dream was still happening. I had always been afraid of dolls, so it made sense to them that my mind would create a doll in a nightmare. Their explanation would have been easier to accept if the hall light had still been on. But it was off when they rushed to my room. Both my mother and sister were certain they had left it on. My mother became annoyed and blamed my sister. She thought my sister must have switched the light off before going to bed, forgetting that I needed it. My sister insisted that she had not touched the switch. She said she knew how afraid I was of the dark and would not have turned the light off. She also said she had checked on me before going to sleep. My door had been open, the hall light had been on, and I had been asleep in bed. My mother said she had gone to bed at around 10 that night. My sister explained that she had stayed awake for about 20 minutes longer. She had gone to the spare bedroom at roughly 10:20 after checking on me and confirming that everything was normal. They argued briefly about who might have turned off the light. Then my mother looked at the clock in my room. It was a Godzilla clock that I remember clearly from my childhood. The time was around 4 in the morning. For a moment, no one said anything. The house had been quiet for more than 5 hours. My mother had been asleep since around 10. My sister had been asleep since shortly after that. Neither of them claimed to have left their rooms or walked through the hallway, yet the light had somehow been switched off at the exact moment I said the doll had jumped and touched the switch. I still remember the look on my mother's face when she realized what time it was. She did not suddenly tell me she believed in the doll, but her expression changed. She looked confused and uneasy. My sister also seemed disturbed, especially because the thing I described had copied her appearance so closely. It was not wearing random clothes. It wore the exact shirt she used as pajamas, including the cartoon basketball players and the words "slam dunk" on the back. I had seen my sister wearing that shirt many times, so it was possible that my mind used it in a dream. That was what they believed. But I knew I had been awake. I remembered sitting up. I remembered seeing the hall light. I remembered moving my legs out from beneath the covers because I wanted water. I remembered hearing the bare feet before I saw the figure. Dreams can feel real, but this did not have the strange, broken quality that most dreams have. The room looked exactly as it should. The hallway was normal. Nothing changed suddenly until the doll appeared. The creature itself was detailed in a way I still find difficult to explain. I could see its hair and face. I could see the shirt moving around its small legs. I heard the light steps on the wooden floor. Most of all, I heard it breathe. That sound has stayed with me for years. A toy should not breathe. A dream should not be able to reach into the real world and turn off a light switch. My mother and sister continued to tell me that I had been dreaming. Their best explanation was that the hall light had already been off when I woke up. According to them, the darkness frightened me, and my mind created the image of the doll. But that was not what happened. The light was on. I saw the doll clearly because the hallway was lit. I watched it walk to the switch. I watched it jump. Then everything went dark. The sequence has never changed in my memory. I sometimes wonder whether I experienced sleep paralysis, but that does not fully fit either. People experiencing sleep paralysis are usually unable to move while waking or falling asleep. I was able to sit up, move my legs, and later jump out of bed. I was frozen only because I was terrified. I also wonder whether I was still partly dreaming while awake. Maybe my brain placed the image of the doll into the hallway even though nothing was there. That could explain why it looked real. But it still does not explain the light switch. Someone or something turned the hall light off. There were no pets in the hallway that could have touched it. The switch was too high for an animal to reach. My mother and sister both swore they had not left their rooms. The doll, however, had jumped up to reach it. That movement was strangely realistic. The creature did not magically stretch its arm or float toward the switch. It was too short, so it jumped like a small child would. I often think about where it came from. It walked from the direction of the spare bedroom, where my sister was sleeping. Did it come out of her room? Had it been standing beside her bed before walking down the hall? Was it copying her because it had seen her sleeping in that shirt? Or was it somehow connected to her in a way I could not understand? The thought of a small copy of my sister moving through the house while the real one slept nearby is deeply unsettling. I also wonder what it would have done if I had not closed my door. It turned off the light and left me in complete darkness. Maybe it only wanted to frighten me. Maybe it knew about my fear of dolls and darkness. Perhaps it planned to enter my room once I could no longer see it. I will never know because I ran to the door and slammed it shut. After that night, I stopped sleeping with my bedroom door open. Before the experience, the open door had made me feel safe. It allowed light into my room and kept me connected to the rest of the house. Afterward, it became something dangerous. An open door meant that something from the hallway could walk into my room. I began sleeping with the door closed, even if the room was dark. I preferred being trapped inside the darkness rather than leaving an open path from the hallway to my bed. That habit stayed with me as I grew older. Even now, I do not sleep with a bedroom door open. It does not matter where I am. I can be at home, in a hotel, at a relative's house, or somewhere I have never visited before. Before I go to sleep, I make sure the door is closed. Sometimes I still think about the sound of bare feet moving across the wooden floor. I remember the small figure slowly appearing from the left side of the doorway. I remember how familiar it looked and how completely wrong it felt. It had my sister's face. It wore my sister's clothes. It breathed like a living thing. It hummed as it walked. Then it jumped up, turned off the light, and disappeared into the darkness. My mother and sister still do not know what happened. They say it was a dream or a childhood panic caused by my fear of dolls. Maybe that is the most reasonable answer. But they have never explained who turned off the hall light. And I have never forgotten how real the doll was. When I was a child, something happened outside my bedroom window that I still cannot explain. It was not a long event, and nothing attacked me or tried to get inside the house. In fact, most of it happened so quickly that for years afterward, I wondered if I had misunderstood what I saw. But there was one detail the next morning that made it difficult for me to convince myself it had only been my imagination. My bedroom was small. There was enough space for my bed, a dresser, and a few other things, but not much room to move around. One window sat in the center of the far wall. From inside the room, that window looked out toward the side of our house and the beginning of the woods nearby. The design of the house made the view from my window a little unusual. My bedroom sat farther back than the rooms on either side of it. The bathroom was on the left, and my parents' bedroom was on the right. Both of those rooms extended farther out than mine, so my room was set inside a kind of narrow space between them. If you stood at my window and looked outside, you could see the outer walls of the bathroom and my parents' room pushing forward on either side. It almost felt as though my window sat at the back of a shallow outdoor passage. The space directly outside was visible, but the walls on the left and right blocked parts of the yard. During the day, there was nothing frightening about it. I could see grass, part of the house, and the tree line beyond the property. At night, however, the shape of the house created deep shadows around my window. Someone or something could move behind either of the rooms and disappear from my view almost immediately. The woods were close enough to the house that we were used to seeing animals. Small creatures sometimes moved through the grass. Deer could appear near the edge of the trees, and strange sounds often came from the darkness. Branches snapped, leaves moved, and animals made calls that could sound unsettling if you did not know what they were. My father was familiar with the area, and he was not easily frightened by the woods. If we heard something outside, he usually had a normal explanation for it. It was a raccoon, a deer, a dog, or the wind. Most of the time, he was probably right. The night this happened, I had just finished taking a shower. I do not remember exactly how old I was, but I was still young enough that darkness could make ordinary things seem frightening. I left the bathroom with a towel wrapped around me and walked into my bedroom. My hair was still wet, and the air outside the bathroom felt cooler against my skin. The house was quiet. Nothing seemed unusual. I entered my room and happened to look toward the window. I was not checking for anything. I did not hear a noise or see movement first. Looking outside was just something I did as I walked into the room. That was when I saw the shape. Something large was moving outside my window. I only saw it for a moment because it was already passing out of view. It moved slowly across the space outside and disappeared behind the outer wall of my parents' bedroom. I did not see enough of it to identify what it was. I could not make out a face, clothing, fur, or any clear part of a body. I only saw a large, dark shape moving in a way that made me think it was standing upright. It seemed too big to be one of the small animals that usually came near the house. The movement was slow and controlled. It did not run like a frightened deer or hurry away like an animal that had suddenly noticed the person watching from the window. It simply moved behind my parents' room and vanished. For a few seconds, I stood frozen in the middle of my bedroom. My first thought was that someone had been outside. The idea immediately frightened me because there was no reason for a person to be walking that close to my bedroom window. The shape had not been far away near the woods. It had been right beside the house. Because of the way the rooms extended outward, whatever I saw had disappeared into the blind area behind my parents' bedroom. From where I stood, I could no longer see it. It might have continued walking toward the front or back of the house, or it might have stopped just beyond the wall. I stared through the window, waiting for it to appear again. Nothing moved. The darkness outside looked empty, but I no longer trusted it. Every shadow seemed capable of hiding something. I suddenly felt very exposed standing there in only a towel. I backed away from the window and went to find my father. I told him I had seen something large moving outside my room. I probably did not explain it very well because I had only caught a brief look. I could not tell him whether it had been a person or an animal. I only knew that it had been big and that it had disappeared behind his bedroom. My dad took me seriously enough to go outside and look. That made me feel a little better, but it also confirmed that the possibility of someone being outside was not completely ridiculous. He did not simply laugh and send me back to my room. He checked around the house. I stayed inside while he searched. He walked along the outer walls, including the area near my window and behind my parents' bedroom. He looked around the yard and then went toward the beginning of the woods beside our home. While he was outside, I kept thinking about the shape. I tried to remember exactly what I had seen. The memory was already difficult to hold on to because it had happened so quickly. It had been large, dark, and slow. That was all I could say for certain. Maybe it had been a deer moving close to the house. In poor light, the body of a deer could look like a large shape. If its head had already passed behind the wall, I might only have seen its back. But the movement did not look right for a deer. It had seemed taller. Maybe it had been a person. That explanation was even more frightening. A stranger could have come from the woods and walked beside our house without anyone noticing. My room was set back between the two other rooms, so the space outside my window was somewhat hidden. Someone standing there might not easily be seen from the road or another part of the property. I wondered whether the person had looked into my window before I entered the room. That thought made me feel sick. My father eventually came back inside. He had not found anything. There was no person hiding near the house and no animal standing in the yard. He had checked the area around the walls and walked into the beginning of the woods, but there was no sign of the large shape I had described. I do not remember whether he found footprints. If he did, they were not unusual enough to matter. The ground around a house near the woods could hold tracks from all kinds of animals. My dad probably told me I had seen a deer or a shadow. Maybe he said the shape had already gone back into the woods. Nothing else happened that night. There was no knocking on the window. No footsteps moved around the house. I did not see the shape again. Still, I did not feel safe in my room. The window seemed much larger than it had before. The darkness outside pressed against the glass, and I could not stop imagining something standing just beyond it. I may have closed the curtains or blinds, but I honestly do not remember. What I remember is the feeling of being watched. As a child, I had always thought of windows as a way to look outside. That night, I understood that they also allowed anything outside to look in. My room was lit. The area beyond the glass was dark. If someone had been standing out there, they could have seen me clearly while remaining almost invisible. Eventually, I went to bed. I probably pulled the blankets close and tried not to look toward the window. The adults had checked outside, and they had found nothing. I told myself the shape had been an animal. That was the only explanation that allowed me to sleep. The next morning, I woke early for school. It was still dark outside. During certain times of the year, I had to get ready before sunrise, so the world beyond my bedroom window remained black, even though morning had technically arrived. A streetlight outside cast an orange glow across the side of the house. The light was not bright enough to illuminate the whole yard, but it shone across my window and made the glass visible. I got out of bed and looked toward it. There, in the morning dew on the outside of the glass, was a handprint. It was not a small mark or a smudge that only looked like fingers if I used my imagination. It was a clear, large handprint pressed against the window. The orange light behind it made the shape easy to see. The palm was wide, and the fingers stretched upward across the glass. They were long, longer than I thought normal fingers should be. Each one seemed narrow and came almost to a point at the end. For a moment, I could not move. The fear from the night before returned instantly. I remembered the large shape passing my window and disappearing behind my parents' room. My father had searched the area and found nothing. Now there was a handprint on the outside of the exact window where I had seen it. The print was too high and too large for me to believe it belonged to a small animal. It looked like the mark of a hand, but not a normal hand. I moved closer to the glass. The shape remained clear in the dew. There was only one print. That somehow made it worse. If someone had leaned against the window, there might have been marks from both hands, clothing, or other parts of the body. Instead, there was one large handprint, as though something had placed its palm against the glass and stood there. I wondered when it had happened. Had the hand touched the window before I saw the shape moving away? Had it returned after my father finished searching? Had it stood outside while I was sleeping? My bed was only a short distance from the window. If something had pressed its hand to the glass during the night, it had been very close to me. I could almost imagine it looking inside. I ran to tell my parents. I expected them to be frightened once they saw the print. I thought the evidence would prove that I had really seen something the night before. But they did not believe me. I do not remember exactly what they said. They may have assumed it was my own handprint left on the inside of the glass. Perhaps they thought I was still upset about the shadow and had convinced myself that an ordinary mark was connected to it. I knew the print was outside. The dew was on the outer surface, and the shape was visible because something had disturbed the moisture. It did not look like an old mark left from someone cleaning or touching the window days earlier. I tried to get them to look. By the time they did, the handprint was gone. I cannot remember exactly how much time passed. Maybe the morning light grew stronger and the dew evaporated. Perhaps the temperature changed quickly. All I remember is that when I tried to show my parents, the print was no longer there. Without the handprint, I had no proof. To them, I was a frightened child who had seen a strange shape in the dark and then imagined a hand on the window the next morning. I understood why they did not believe me, but that did not make it any less upsetting. I knew what I had seen. The handprint had been clear. The long fingers had stood out in the orange light. The tips were narrow and almost pointed. It did not look like the hand of anyone in my family. For years, I tried to think of normal explanations. Maybe the large shape had been my father or another family member walking outside, but my father had been inside when I told him what happened, and there was no reason for anyone else to be near my window. Maybe it was a deer or another large animal. The woods were close, and animals sometimes wandered beside the house, but that did not explain the handprint. Some animals have paws that can leave strange marks. A raccoon's tracks, for example, can look almost like tiny human hands. But the print on my window was large. It was far bigger than a raccoon's paw, and it was high enough on the glass that a small animal would have needed to climb. Even then, a raccoon would likely leave several marks, not one perfect handprint with long fingers. A bear might be able to place a large paw against a window, but the shape did not look like a paw. The fingers were too long and narrow. There were no obvious claw marks. Also, I believe the shape I saw moving outside had been upright, not walking like a bear. Maybe the print belonged to a person. That is the most normal explanation, but it is also one of the most disturbing. A person could have walked out of the woods, approached our house, and stood close enough to place a hand against my bedroom window. But who would do that? We did not live in a place where strangers regularly walked through the yard. The window was not near a public path. Anyone standing there would have chosen to leave the road, approach the house, and enter the narrow space between the bathroom and my parents' bedroom. They would also have needed unusually long fingers, unless the dew had stretched or changed the shape. If it was a person, they disappeared before my father searched the yard and the woods. Then, sometime before morning, they either returned or had already left the print behind. That explanation does not make me feel better than the idea of something supernatural. Memory can become unreliable over time, especially childhood memory. I know that. Every time I think about the event, I ask myself whether the shape was really as large as I remember. Maybe the fingers only seemed long because I was frightened. Perhaps the orange light distorted the print. But the fear I felt was real. I remember standing in my room after the shower and seeing the dark shape move slowly out of view. I remember my father searching around the house. I remember waking before sunrise and seeing that single handprint glowing on the glass. Most of all, I remember the frustration of trying to show my parents and finding that it had disappeared. Had the print remained for another hour, my parents might have believed me. My father might have gone outside again and searched more carefully. We might have found tracks beneath the window. Instead, the dew vanished and took the only evidence with it. After that, I became much more aware of the window. I looked at it differently at night. I checked the space outside before changing clothes or getting ready for bed. Sometimes I thought I saw movement near the edge of the wall, but it was always a branch, a shadow, or my own reflection. I never saw the large shape again. No second handprint appeared on the glass. Nothing scratched at the window, and no one tried to enter the house. That should have made the memory easier to dismiss. Instead, the fact that it happened only once made it feel even stranger. Whatever passed outside my room seemed to appear for only a moment. It moved slowly behind my parents' room, vanished before my father could find it, and left one large handprint in the morning dew. Then, it was gone. Sometimes I wonder if the handprint had been there before I entered the room that night. Maybe the shape I saw was moving away after standing at my window. If that was true, it may have been looking inside before I noticed it. Other times, I think it returned later. Perhaps it watched my father search the woods from somewhere beyond the trees. After he went back inside, it could have approached the house again, entered the narrow space outside my room, and placed one hand against the glass. I do not know which possibility frightens me more. Even now, I cannot look at a handprint on a fogged or wet window without remembering that morning. I can still picture the orange streetlight shining through the glass and outlining the palm and fingers. It was large. The fingers were long. The tips came almost to points, and whatever left it had been standing directly outside the bedroom of a sleeping child. When I was a young teenager, my mom and my middle brother went to Idaho to visit my aunt and uncle. They had recently built a few small cabins deep in the woods because they wanted to open a quiet, old-fashioned bed and breakfast. It was the kind of place people visited when they wanted to escape the noise of cities and spend a few peaceful days surrounded by trees. The cabins were simple but comfortable, and the whole property had a warm, rustic feeling. There were tall pine trees in every direction, narrow dirt paths between the buildings, and almost no sound at night except for insects, wind moving through the branches, and the occasional animal somewhere in the darkness. My mom had been excited about visiting them and seeing what they had built. My middle brother went along with her, but for some reason, my youngest brother, Spencer, stayed home with my dad and me. I do not remember exactly why he did not go. Maybe he did not feel like traveling, or maybe there was not enough room. It might have been because he had already started feeling sick. Whatever the reason was, he stayed behind, and that decision nearly cost him his life. Spencer had started complaining about pain in his stomach. At first, it did not seem serious. Children often complain about stomach aches, especially after eating something they should not have eaten, or when they are coming down with a common illness. I do not think any of us understood how much pain he was actually in. He may not have understood it himself. He was still young, and young children do not always know how to explain what is happening inside their bodies. They just know that something hurts. My dad should have paid closer attention, but he was an alcoholic in every sense of the word. Drinking controlled most of his life, and when he was drinking, everything else became less important. Our problems were often treated like inconveniences. If one of us felt ill, he did not want to spend time trying to understand the symptoms or taking us to a doctor. His usual solution was simple. He would pour out 2 small shots of NyQuil, hand them to us, and tell us to go to bed. In his mind, sleep was the answer to almost everything. A headache, a fever, a cough, stomach pain, it did not matter. Take some medicine, lie down, and stop bothering him. That was more or less what happened with Spencer. He said his stomach hurt, but my dad did not take it seriously. He gave him medicine and told him to rest. As the hours passed, however, Spencer did not get better. His pain slowly grew worse. He stayed in bed, sweating beneath the blankets, while my dad continued drinking. I wish I could say that I understood the danger and tried to help him, but I was only a young teenager. I trusted the adults around me to know what to do. Even when those adults failed us, part of me still believed they must have had some idea of what was happening. I knew my dad drank too much, and I knew he was not always responsible. But I did not yet understand how quickly an ordinary stomachache could become a medical emergency. I had no way of knowing that something inside my little brother was becoming dangerously swollen, and that every passing hour was bringing him closer to death. Meanwhile, my mom was hundreds of miles away in Idaho. The cabins where she was staying were surrounded by miles of woods. At night, the place became almost completely dark. There were no city lights nearby and very little traffic. Once everyone had gone to sleep, the silence must have felt heavy. My aunt and uncle's dream was to create a peaceful retreat, but there was also something strange about being so far away from everything. There were no busy roads, glowing shops, or neighbors close enough to hear someone calling for help. It was the kind of darkness that could make a person feel cut off from the rest of the world. My mom had no reason to believe anything terrible was happening at home. She knew Spencer had complained about stomach pain, but she had left him with his father. She probably assumed my dad would take care of him if his condition became worse. She had no phone call from a doctor and no clear warning that she needed to return. Still, something happened that night that neither of us has ever been able to explain. I went to bed as usual, But sometime during the night, I had one of the most disturbing dreams of my life. It was not a long dream with a beginning and an ending. There were no conversations, no movement, and no changing scenes. It was more like a single frozen image placed directly into my mind. In the dream, my entire family was gathered together. Everyone stood close, crowded around something in the center of the room. At first, I could not understand what they were looking at. Then I saw Spencer. My baby brother was lying there, completely still. He was dead. His body looked small and lifeless, and the faces around him were filled with shock and grief. The image was so clear that it did not feel like an ordinary nightmare. It felt like I had opened my eyes somewhere else and seen a moment that was waiting to happen. I do not remember hearing anyone cry or scream. I only remember the unbearable certainty that Spencer was gone. The dream frightened me so badly that I woke up suddenly. For a few seconds, I did not know where I was. My room was dark, and everything around me was quiet. My heart was pounding, and the image of my family standing around Spencer's body was still sharp in my mind. Usually, after waking from a nightmare, the details begin to disappear. Within a few minutes, the dream feels distant and strange. This one did not. It stayed with me exactly as I had seen it, like a photograph burned into my memory. I remember lying there and thinking about Spencer. I do not know whether I went to check on him immediately or whether I stayed frozen in bed for a while, trying to convince myself that it had only been a dream. What I do remember is that when I got up, my mother was gone. That discovery did not make sense at first. My mother had been in Idaho with my brother, staying at my aunt and uncle's place. She was not supposed to be home. Yet sometime during the night, something had happened that caused her to leave the cabins and rush to the airport. She had experienced what she later described as a similar warning or omen. I do not know exactly what she saw or felt, and I do not know whether it came to her as a dream like mine. Maybe she saw Spencer in danger. Maybe she woke with a sudden certainty that something was horribly wrong. Whatever it was powerful enough to make her act immediately. She did not wait until morning. She did not call home, accept my dad's reassurance, and return to sleep. She caught the first flight she could find and came back in the middle of the night. That part of the story has always stayed with me. Traveling at that hour was not simple, especially from a remote place in Idaho. She would have had to leave the cabins, travel through the darkness to reach an airport, find an available flight, and get home as quickly as possible. She did all of that without having clear proof that Spencer was dying. All she had was a feeling, a warning that something was wrong. Most people might have talked themselves out of it. They might have said it was only anxiety or a bad dream. They might have decided to call in the morning. My mom did not ignore it. Something inside her told her that she needed to go home, and she listened. When she finally arrived, she found Spencer lying in bed. By then, his condition was terrifying. He was sweating heavily, and his stomach had become swollen and stretched. He was crying from the pain. This was no longer a child with a mild stomachache who needed sleep. He looked seriously ill, and it was obvious that he needed immediate medical attention. My dad had either failed to notice how much worse Spencer had become, or had noticed and still done nothing. Alcohol had made him careless, slow, and disconnected from what was happening in front of him. While my little brother's body was reaching a breaking point, the adult responsible for him had been too busy drinking to understand the danger. The moment Spencer saw my mom, he said something that has never left our family. Through the pain and tears, he looked at her and said, "Mom, I knew you'd come. I knew you'd make it." Those words still give me chills. He had been alone in his suffering, trapped in bed while the one adult in the house ignored the seriousness of his condition. Yet somehow, he believed our mother was coming. No one had told him she was on a plane. No one had promised him she would return that night. As far as he knew, she was still far away in Idaho. But when she walked into the room, he did not seem surprised. He spoke as if he had been waiting for her because he already knew she was on her way. My mom did not waste time asking questions. She saw the swelling, the sweat, and the pain, and she understood that something was very wrong. She rushed Spencer to the hospital. I can only imagine what that drive must have felt like. She had just traveled through the night because of a warning she could not explain, and now her youngest child was crying beside her with his stomach swollen. Every minute must have felt dangerous. There was no way to know whether she had arrived in time. There was no way to know whether something inside him had already ruptured. She could only keep driving and hope that the doctors would be able to save him. At the hospital, the doctors examined Spencer and quickly discovered the cause of the pain. His appendix was dangerously inflamed. It was not simply irritated or mildly swollen. It was on the edge of bursting. A ruptured appendix can release infection throughout the abdomen, and without fast treatment, it can become fatal. The doctors told my mother that Spencer's appendix was literally about to burst. They believed that if she had not come home when she did, he almost certainly would have been dead by morning. That was how close it was. A few more hours in that bed, with my father drinking and ignoring him, and the frozen image from my dream might have become real. Spencer received emergency treatment, and thankfully, the doctors were able to save him. The worst outcome never happened. My family never had to gather around his body the way I had seen in my dream. Instead, my mother's sudden decision to come home interrupted whatever terrible future had been forming. It felt as though she had been warned at the last possible moment. Had she waited until daylight, she might have arrived too late. Had she dismissed the feeling as fear or homesickness, Spencer might not have survived. Had she taken the next available flight instead of the first one, even that small delay could have changed everything. I have often wondered what exactly happened that night. It is possible that my mother was already worried about Spencer before she left, and that her concern followed her into sleep. Perhaps she noticed something about his pain that the rest of us missed. Maybe her mind connected small details and created an urgent feeling while she was far away. The same could be said about my dream. I may have known that Spencer was sick, even if I did not consciously understand the risk. My fear for him might have become a nightmare. That is the logical explanation. And perhaps it is true. But logic does not explain everything. It does not explain why my dream was so specific. I did not dream that Spencer was merely sick or that he was crying in bed. I saw him dead, surrounded by our entire family. It does not explain why my mother woke with a similar warning at almost the same time and felt so strongly that she had to travel home immediately. It does not explain why Spencer told her he knew she would come. Three people, separated by distance and age, seemed to understand the same thing without speaking to one another. Spencer was in terrible danger, and our mother needed to reach him before morning. Maybe families are connected in ways we do not fully understand. Perhaps a mother can sense when her child is in danger, even from hundreds of miles away. Perhaps siblings can feel it too. Some people would call it instinct. Others might call it coincidence, a shared fear, or the mind's ability to recognize warning signs that we do not consciously notice. There are also people who would call it something spiritual, as if some force outside of us stepped in and sent a warning before it was too late. I do not know which explanation is correct. I only know what happened. My mother was in Idaho, sleeping in a cabin deep in the woods. I was at home, asleep in my own bed. Spencer was lying in another room, sweating and crying as his appendix moved closer to bursting. My father was there physically, but because of his drinking, he was not truly present. Then, in the same night, my mother and I both experienced warnings that Spencer was going to die. She listened to hers and came home. I woke with the image of his death still clear in my mind. Spencer, somehow, had been waiting for her. The doctors were certain that the timing saved his life. By morning, the situation would probably have ended very differently. Whenever I think about that night, I think about how narrow the distance was between life and death. It was not a matter of weeks or even days. It was only a few hours. While most of the house slept, Spencer's body was approaching the point where it could no longer protect him. If my mother had arrived a little later, the dream might have become a memory. What frightens me most is not only that Spencer nearly died. It is the possibility that, for one brief moment, I saw what was going to happen if no one intervened. The image did not feel symbolic. It felt final. Our family stood around his corpse because that was where the night was heading. My mother's decision changed it. She got out of bed, left the cabins, traveled to the airport, caught a flight, came home, and found him before the worst could happen. Whether she was guided by instinct, love, fear, or something we cannot explain, she made it. Spencer survived, and life continued. The emergency slowly became a family story, something we repeated over the years because of how strange and frightening it had been. But for me, it never became an ordinary memory. I can still see that frozen picture from my dream. I can still imagine waking in the darkness with the certainty that my youngest brother was dead. I can still hear the words he said when my mother entered the room. "Mom, I knew you'd come. I knew you'd make it." Those words are comforting because she did make it. She arrived before his appendix burst. She got him to the hospital while there was still time. But they are also unsettling because they suggest Spencer knew something none of us had told him. Perhaps, while he lay in pain, he felt the same connection that woke my mother and entered my dream. Perhaps he sensed her moving toward him through the night. Maybe all three of us were connected by one terrible warning, a message passing silently between members of the same family. I do not know whether I believe in omens. I do not know whether dreams can show us possible futures or whether people can sense danger across great distances. Before that night, I might have said such things were impossible. Afterward, I was no longer certain. Too many details matched. The dream, my mother's sudden departure, Spencer's words, and the doctor's warning all pointed toward the same conclusion. He was going to die before morning, and somehow we were warned. There are moments in life when the line between coincidence and something supernatural becomes difficult to see. This was one of those moments. A child was dying quietly in a house where the adult responsible for him was too drunk to help. His mother was far away, surrounded by dark woods, with no clear reason to believe she needed to return. His sibling dreamed of his death. Then, his mother woke with the same fear and crossed hundreds of miles to save him. When she arrived, the child looked at her as if he had known all along. Had she ignored that warning, our family might have spent the rest of our lives grieving Spencer. Instead, we remember the night he almost died, and the strange feeling that something, instinct, love, fate, or perhaps something beyond our understanding, refused to let it happen. I was about 10 years old when this happened. I was visiting my grandparents in Mexico with my family, something we used to do from time to time when I was younger. Their home was in a rural area, far enough away from the busy parts of town that nights became very dark and quiet. The house itself was not the nicest looking place, at least not compared with the homes I was used to seeing back home. The walls were old, some parts of the property looked worn down, and dust seemed to cover almost everything outside. Still, it was a comfortable place in its own way. My grandparents were kind to us, there was always food, and during the day the property felt warm and alive. They kept several farm animals, and I enjoyed watching them when I was a child. There were chickens scratching through the dirt, animals calling from their pens, and horses moving around near the stable. During daylight, none of it frightened me. It felt like a normal country home, only rougher and more isolated than the places I usually stayed. At night, however, the whole property changed. The open land became a wide area of darkness. There were very few lights outside, and once everyone went to bed, the sounds of the animals became much easier to hear. The house creaked, insects buzzed near the windows, and wind moved gently through the dry plants and trees around the yard. Sometimes a chicken would make noise for no clear reason, or a horse would shift inside its enclosure. My grandparents were used to it, so they barely noticed those sounds. To them, it was simply part of living around animals. I was not as familiar with it, but after staying there for a few nights, I had started to ignore most of the noises too. My brothers, sisters, and I were all sleeping together in the guest room. There were several beds and blankets spread around the room, and everyone had gone to sleep after a long day. I do not remember exactly what we had done before bed, but I remember being tired. The room was dark and warm, and the only sounds were the soft breathing of my siblings and the quiet noises coming from outside. I must have been asleep for a while when something woke me. At first, I was not sure what I was hearing. It was a slow, repeating sound coming from somewhere outside the house. Clop, 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 it sounded like hooves moving across the hard ground. I stayed in bed for a moment, listening. The sound continued at a steady pace, moving close enough to the house that I could hear it clearly. Because my grandparents owned farm animals, the noise did not seem strange at first. Their animals sometimes escaped their enclosures. A gate might not close properly, or one of them might push through a weak part of the fence. I had heard my family complain about it before. Usually, one of the adults would go outside and guide the animal back into its pen. For some reason, I decided I would take care of it myself. Looking back, that choice makes no sense to me. It was very late. I was only 10 years old, and I was in a place that became almost completely dark after sunset. I should have woken my parents or my grandparents. I should have stayed under the blankets and let one of the adults deal with the loose animal in the morning. Instead, I felt annoyed that the sound had disturbed my sleep. I remember being grumpy more than frightened. I wanted the noise to stop so I could go back to bed. Without waking anyone, I climbed out of bed and went to my suitcase. I found my sandals and slipped them onto my feet. I moved carefully through the room so I would not wake my brothers and sisters. None of them stirred. I opened the door, walked through the dark house, and made my way outside. The night air touched my face as soon as I stepped through the door. It was cooler than the daytime heat, but still mild. The property looked completely different under the dark sky. Shapes that seemed ordinary during the day had turned into shadows. The pens, fences, trees, and small buildings around the yard looked larger and stranger. There was enough moonlight to see parts of the ground, but most of the property remained hidden in darkness. I listened again for the sound of hooves. It came from somewhere ahead of me. Clop. Clop. Then I saw one of my grandparents' horses. It was a young horse. I did not know much about horses then, and I still do not know enough to describe its breed or exact size. I only remember that it was younger and smaller than some of the others my grandparents owned. It was standing outside its pen, moving slowly through the yard. That seemed to explain everything. The animal had escaped, wandered close to the house, and woken me with the sound of its hooves. Seeing the horse made me feel better. There was no mystery and no reason to be afraid. I was simply going to guide it back to its enclosure and return to bed. I stepped closer and called gently to it. To my surprise, the horse listened. It did not run from me or become nervous. It came close enough for me to reach its reins. I took hold of them and began leading it across the property toward the pen. At first, the horse followed without any problem. Its hooves made the same steady clopping sound that had woken me. I walked ahead of it, still tired and irritated, thinking only about getting back inside. For the first part of the walk, everything seemed normal. Then the horse started to slow down. We were getting closer to its pen when it stopped completely. I pulled gently on the reins, expecting it to take another step. It did not move. I pulled again, a little harder this time, but the horse remained where it was. Its behavior changed so quickly that I became confused. A moment earlier, it had been calm and willing to follow me. Now, it seemed frightened. The horse lifted its head and stared toward the enclosure. Its body became tense. It shifted its weight backward and refused to go any closer. I could hear its breathing becoming faster. It moved its feet nervously against the ground, but every movement carried it away from the pen instead of toward it. I did not understand why it was acting that way. I had seen animals become stubborn before, and because I was only 10, I assumed it simply did not want to return to its enclosure. Maybe it enjoyed being free. Maybe it knew I was a child and thought it could ignore me. I became annoyed again and tried to pull it forward. The horse resisted with more strength. That was when I began to notice how scared it looked. It was not behaving like an animal that wanted to continue wandering. It was behaving like something near the pen had terrified it. Its attention stayed fixed on the enclosure, and it would not take a single step closer. It seemed ready to turn and run. I looked toward the pen, but from where I stood, I could not see anything unusual. The gate was closed, and the area inside looked dark and empty. I decided I would walk over and open it. I thought that if the horse saw there was nothing inside, it might calm down and follow me. Again, I was thinking like a stubborn child. I did not consider the possibility that the horse could sense something I could not. I let go of the reins and started walking toward the pen. Almost immediately, I noticed a change in the air. I began to feel warm. At first, I thought the heat came from walking outside in Mexico. The country was hot during the day, and the ground often seemed to hold warmth long after sunset. But this felt different. The night had been comfortable when I stepped outside. The air around the house and the yard had been cool enough that I had not thought about the temperature at all. The closer I moved to the pen, the hotter it became. It was not a slow change caused by the weather. The heat seemed to be coming directly from the enclosure. With every step, it grew stronger. Warmth pressed against my face and arms. By the time I was only a short distance from the gate, it felt as if I were standing near an open fire. I stopped and looked around. There was no fire. There were no lamps, machines, or anything else that should have created that much heat. The ground was dry, but nothing was burning. The smell of smoke was not in the air. Behind me, the horse remained several yards away. It would not come closer. That should have been enough to make me turn back. Then, a thought appeared in my mind. Go back to bed. It was not exactly a voice that I heard with my ears. It felt more like a strong warning inside my head. The words were clear even though no one had spoken them. Go back. Return to the house. Leave this place alone. For a moment, I stood still and considered listening to it. Every part of the situation had become wrong. The horse was frightened, the air was becoming hotter, and something inside me was warning me to turn around. But I was stubborn. I told myself that I was imagining things because it was dark. I thought I might feel foolish in the morning if I left the horse outside simply because I became scared. I decided to keep going. With each step toward the enclosure, the heat increased. My skin began to feel uncomfortable. Sweat formed on my face and neck. The darkness inside the pen seemed thicker than the darkness surrounding it. I could no longer hear normal nighttime sounds. I do not remember insects, animals, or wind. It felt as if the property had become completely silent. I reached the gate. My hands were shaking slightly, although I did not want to admit I was afraid. I grabbed the latch and opened the pen. That was when I saw it. Something was standing inside the enclosure. At first, I thought it was a person. Its body had a human shape, with a head, shoulders, arms, and legs. But the longer I looked at it, the more I understood that something was wrong. The way it stood was not normal. Its posture seemed twisted or unnatural, as if its body did not fit together correctly. It was standing upright, but there was something strange about the angle of its shoulders and the position of its limbs. It looked almost like a person trying to copy the way humans stand without fully understanding how to do it. It was also too tall. The figure seemed much taller than any adult I knew. Inside the darkness of the pen, its body stretched upward in a way that made it look thin and unnatural. I could not make out clothing, skin, or any clear details below its face. I only saw the shape of something that looked human but did not feel human. Then I saw its eyes. They looked almost white. They did not shine like an animal's eyes reflecting light. They looked pale and empty, standing out against the darkness around them. The figure did not blink or turn away. It stared directly at me. I could not move. For what felt like an eternity, I stood at the open gate and stared back. My mind tried to understand what I was seeing. I wanted it to become something normal. I wanted my eyes to adjust and reveal that it was a coat hanging from a post, a piece of farm equipment, or one of my relatives standing in the shadows. It did not change. The figure remained perfectly still. The heat around me had become almost unbearable. I felt as if I were standing inside an oven. My body knew I was in danger, but fear had locked me in place. I could not scream. I could not call for my parents. I could not even step backward. The thing continued watching me with its pale eyes. I do not know how long we stood there. It may have been only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Time seemed to stop inside that enclosure. There was only the figure, the darkness, and the heat surrounding me. Then, something inside me finally broke free from the fear. I turned and ran. I did not close the gate. I did not look for the horse. I did not check whether the thing followed me. I simply ran toward the house as fast as I could. My sandals struck the dry ground, sending dust into the air behind me. I could hear my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. Every part of me expected to hear footsteps or hooves chasing after me. I was afraid that if I looked back, I would see the tall figure moving behind me. So I kept my eyes on the house. The distance felt much longer than it had before. The doorway seemed far away, and the darkness around me felt full of movement. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision. I imagined long arms reaching toward me from behind fences and trees. When I finally reached the house, I rushed inside and closed the door. I should have woken my parents. I should have screamed for my grandparents and told them something was inside the horse's pen. Instead, I went back to the guest room. I was so scared that I thought hiding in bed would protect me. That is the kind of logic a terrified child uses. The blankets felt like a safe place, even though I knew they could not stop whatever I had seen. I moved quietly across the room and climbed into bed. My brothers and sisters were still asleep. None of them knew I had gone outside. I pulled the covers over myself and tried not to make a sound. My whole body was shaking. I listened for movement in the hallway, the sound of the front door opening, or footsteps outside the window. I expected the figure to appear in the room at any moment. I do not remember how long I stayed awake. At some point, fear and exhaustion must have pulled me back to sleep. The next morning, I woke suddenly. For a few seconds, I thought the whole experience had been a nightmare. Daylight filled the room, and my siblings were beginning to wake up. The house sounded normal again. I could hear people moving, voices from another room, and animals outside. Then I remembered the horse. I remembered the heat. I remembered the figure inside the pen and its almost white eyes. I jumped out of bed and ran to find my parents. I told them everything as quickly as I could. I explained that I had heard hooves, gone outside, found a young horse, and tried to lead it back to its enclosure. I told them how the horse had refused to approach the pen. I described the sudden heat and the tall figure standing inside. The adults did not believe me. They said I must have had a nightmare. Their explanation made sense to them because the stable and the animal enclosures were always locked at night. They asked me how a horse could have escaped if the gates were secured. None of the other animals were missing. There was no sign that anyone or anything had entered the pen. They suggested that I had dreamed the entire event. Part of me wanted to believe them. A nightmare would have been easier to accept. Children have frightening dreams, especially when sleeping in unfamiliar places. Maybe I had heard an animal outside while asleep and built the rest of the experience around that sound. Perhaps the heat, the horse, and the figure had all been created by my mind. But then I looked at my sandals. They were covered in dust. The dirt was the same dry dust that covered the yard outside. It clung to the soles and sides, showing that I had run through the property during the night. I knew those sandals had been inside my suitcase. I had not worn them earlier during the visit. I clearly remembered taking them out before leaving the guest room. I remembered slipping them onto my feet and walking outside. If the whole thing had been a dream, how had the sandals become dirty? I showed them to my family, but it did not change much. They suggested that I might have sleepwalked. Maybe I had wandered outside while still asleep, dirtied my sandals, and returned to bed. The strange figure could have been part of the dream I experienced while walking. That explanation was possible, but it did not make me feel better. If I had been sleepwalking, I had still gone outside alone. I had still crossed the property and returned with dust on my shoes. Something had caused the young horse to move through the yard, unless even that part had happened only in my mind. I also remembered the experience too clearly. The reins in my hand felt real. The horse's fear felt real. The heat near the enclosure felt real. The figure's eyes felt real. Most dreams disappear after waking. Their details become confused, and parts of them stop making sense. This memory stayed sharp. I can still picture the horse refusing to move. Animals notice things people do not. They hear sounds from farther away, smell scents we cannot detect, and react to danger before humans understand it is there. The horse had followed me calmly until we approached the pen. Then it became terrified. Whatever was inside that enclosure, the horse knew it was there before I did. That thought has stayed with me more than anything else. Over the years, I have tried to explain the experience in normal ways. Maybe there was a stranger hiding in the stable. Perhaps the white eyes were caused by moonlight. The strange posture could have come from the shadows and the angle at which I saw the person. But why would a stranger be standing inside a locked animal pen in the middle of the night? Why was it so hot near the enclosure? Why did the horse refuse to approach? And why did the figure simply stare at me? I have also wondered whether I was hallucinating. Children can become confused when they wake suddenly, especially in unfamiliar surroundings. I might have been partly asleep and unable to separate a dream from reality. Still, the dusty sandals remained difficult to explain. They proved that I left the room. They proved that I walked or ran outside. They proved that at least part of the experience truly happened. After that visit, I began to feel differently about my grandparents' home. During the day, I could almost forget what happened. I would see the animals, the bright sky, and the familiar faces of my family. Everything seemed safe and ordinary. At night, the memory returned. I would lie awake listening to the animals. Every sound of hooves made my body tense. I imagined the young horse walking through the darkness again, not because it had escaped, but because something had driven it from its enclosure. I wondered whether the figure was still there. Whenever I visited my grandparents after that, I began having nightmares. Some were about the stable. Others were simply filled with darkness, heat, and the feeling that something tall was watching me. I often woke before seeing its face, but I always knew it was the same thing. The nightmares made me dislike visiting the property as much as I once had. I loved my grandparents, but their home no longer felt peaceful. Every time I arrived, I remembered that night. I remembered standing at the gate of the pen. I remembered the unnatural shape of the figure. I remembered its almost white eyes staring at me from the darkness. To this day, I do not know what I saw. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe there was a normal person inside the enclosure, although that explanation brings its own frightening questions. Or maybe I saw something that did not belong there. All I know is that I was 10 years old. I woke to the sound of hooves, and I followed a young horse across my grandparents' property in the middle of the night. The animal refused to return to its pen because something was already standing inside. I ignored every warning telling me to turn back. I opened the enclosure, and something that looked almost human was waiting for me.
We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal.
When I was in high school, my friends and I used to go on what we called valley rides. There was not much to do where we lived, especially at night, so driving around became one of our main ways of passing the time. The valleys outside town were mostly empty and rural. There were long roads that curved through fields, farms, and wooded areas, with only a few houses spread far apart. Sometimes we could drive for miles without seeing another car. Police almost never went out there unless someone called them, which made the roads even more popular with teenagers who wanted to get away from parents, teachers, and anyone else who might ask questions. We would pile into someone's car, bring a few bottles of cheap beer, turn the music up, and drive without any real destination. One person stayed behind the wheel while the rest of us talked, laughed, passed drinks around, and watched the dark countryside slide past the windows. It probably was not the safest thing we could have been doing, but at that age, safety was not something we spent much time thinking about. We felt hidden out there. The roads seemed to belong to us. The first valley was not completely flat. There were long hills, sharp dips, and narrow stretches, where the road disappeared between trees before opening again into farmland. At the far end of the valley, mountains rose up and formed a natural wall. There was a road that climbed over one of them and dropped into the next valley. Sometimes we stayed in the first valley and made a shorter loop back toward town. Other nights, when we had more time and more gas, we went over the mountain and continued into the next valley. Those longer rides could last for hours. We knew most of those roads by memory, even in the dark. We knew where the pavement was rough, where deer often crossed, where old farmhouses sat back from the road, and where we could pull over without anyone bothering us. The night I remember most clearly started like any other valley ride. There were several of us in the car, although I cannot remember the exact number now. We had music playing and a few 40-ounce bottles of beer between us. Everyone was relaxed, talking over one another and joking about things that seemed important at the time, but probably meant nothing. The driver kept the car moving at a steady speed as we went deeper into the valley. It was dark enough that almost everything beyond the headlights disappeared. Every now and then we would pass a porch light or see the distant glow from a farmhouse, but most of the landscape was just black shapes against the sky. We were getting close to the end of the first valley when the road climbed another hill. From that point, the mountains ahead were easier to see. One of them formed part of the border between our valley and the next one. As we came over the top of the hill, someone noticed a small light above the mountain. At first, it did not look impressive. It was just a tiny orange point in the distance, like a dim star or a light on a tower. Because it was low over the ridge, I thought it might have been a plane coming toward us from far away. It could also have been a helicopter, although we almost never saw helicopters in that area. For a few seconds, no one said much. We simply watched it through the windshield. Then the light began to move. It was not moving like a normal aircraft. It did not travel in a straight line or slowly cross the sky. It seemed to shift from side to side in a controlled but strange pattern. The movement was smooth, not fast or nervous, and it looked almost as if the light was following a path we could not see. Someone turned the music down so we could focus on it. We all leaned forward or moved closer to the windows. The joking stopped. Everyone in the car was suddenly watching the same small orange light above the mountain. A few seconds later, another light appeared near it. Then, another. At first, they came one at a time, but more quickly after that. Within maybe 10 or 15 seconds, there were dozens of orange lights in the sky. I would guess there were around 50 of them, although it was difficult to count because they were constantly moving. They all had the same warm orange color and seemed to be about the same size. None of them flashed red or green like ordinary airplanes. They did not have bright white beams or searchlights. They were simply glowing orange points moving together over the mountain. The way they moved was the strangest part. They did not spread randomly across the sky. They followed the same organized pattern. The closest way I can describe it is to imagine strands of DNA twisting around each other. The lights seemed to pair off, with two lights circling inward and outward around one another. But those pairs were also part of a much larger shape. The whole formation looked like a giant corkscrew turning slowly upward. Each pair twisted as it moved, while the entire group followed the same rising spiral. It was complicated but perfectly controlled. Nothing crashed into anything else. None of the lights broke away. They moved as if they were all connected or being directed by the same system. For a moment, none of us knew what to say. The car continued rolling down the far side of the hill, but the driver slowed almost to a stop. We stared through the windshield, trying to understand what we were seeing. Someone said they might be planes, but that explanation did not make sense. There were too many of them, and planes could not move around each other like that. Someone else suggested helicopters, but we could not hear any engines, and the movement still looked impossible. Another person said they might be fireworks, but they were not exploding or fading. They stayed bright and continued twisting upward in the same pattern. We stopped for only an instant before someone told the driver to head toward the mountain. The road that climbed over it was not far away. If we drove in that direction, we might be able to get closer and see what the lights actually were. The driver turned at the next opportunity and started toward the base of the mountain. We were excited, but also nervous. At that age, curiosity usually defeated good judgment. Instead of thinking that maybe we should go back to town, we wanted to get closer. The orange lights continued moving above the ridge while we drove. From our angle, it was hard to tell how far away they were. They could have been just beyond the mountain, or much farther in the distance. The formation seemed huge, but without knowing the size of the lights, there was no real way to judge it. We kept watching as the road narrowed and began to rise slightly. The closer we got to the mountain, the more serious everyone became. Nobody was laughing anymore. Even the people who had been drinking were focused on what was happening outside. Then, just as we reached the bottom of the mountain, every light disappeared at once. They did not slowly fade. They did not move behind clouds. They did not drop below the ridge one by one. 1 second, there were dozens of orange lights twisting together in the sky. The next second, the sky was completely dark. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and turned them all off at the exact same time. The silence inside the car after that was uncomfortable. We kept looking at the place where the lights had been, expecting them to return. They did not. Someone asked if maybe the mountain had blocked our view, but that did not seem right. We could still see the same part of the sky. There were no clouds thick enough to hide them. The whole formation had simply vanished. Even though the lights were gone, we decided to keep going. We had already come that far, and everyone wanted to know if there was something happening on the other side of the mountain. Maybe there was an event, a military exercise, or some kind of private gathering. We had no idea. We continued toward the road that climbed over the ridge. Before we could start up the mountain, we found a barricade stretched across the road. It was not a large or impressive barrier. It was just a normal white and orange piece of wood resting on 2 stands. It looked like the type of temporary barricade a town road crew might use during construction. There were no warning signs, flashing lights, or workers nearby. There was no explanation for why the road was closed. It had been placed at the last point, where a driver could turn off before starting up the mountain. We stopped in front of it and argued about what to do. Half of us wanted to get out, move the barricade, and continue. It would have been easy. We could have lifted it, driven through, and placed it back behind us. The other half thought that was a bad idea. The lights had already made everyone uneasy, and the roadblocks seemed too well placed to be a coincidence. It was not somewhere in the middle of the mountain where road damage might have happened. It was exactly at the entrance, where it prevented anyone from going farther. The driver made the final decision. He did not want to move the barricade, so he turned the car around. Some people complained, but I think most of us felt relieved. Whatever was happening beyond that mountain, we were no longer sure we wanted to see it up close. We started driving back toward town. The strange lights were no longer visible behind us. The valley looked normal again, but the mood in the car had changed. Everyone kept talking about what we had seen. We repeated the same questions without finding any answers. Were they aircraft? Lanterns? Military flares? Something falling through the atmosphere? No explanation fit the movement. The pattern had been too organized. As we got closer to town, we joined one of the more heavily traveled roads in the area. It was still quiet compared with a city road, but more cars used it because it led toward the next town and could be taken instead of the interstate. After several minutes, we saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A white Ford passed us. At first, there was nothing especially strange about it, but it looked like an unmarked police car. It had the shape and style of the white sedans law enforcement often used at the time. It was clean, plain, and had no markings on the doors. We all noticed it, because police vehicles were rare in that part of the valley, especially late at night. Still, one car did not prove anything. It could have belonged to anyone. A few miles later, another white Ford approached us. This one caught our attention immediately because a black Suburban was driving close behind it. The SUV was completely dark from what I could see. Black paint, dark windows, no visible markings. In the darkness, it looked like the kind of government vehicle people saw in movies. Of course, I was already nervous from the lights, so I may have been reading too much into it. It could have been a family driving home. It could have been two unrelated vehicles going in the same direction. But because both were heading toward the mountain we had just left, everyone in our car noticed. We watched them disappear behind us. No one suggested turning around again. By the time we reached the hill overlooking town, we were ready for the night to become normal. Instead, we saw a car burning in the middle of Main Street. From the top of the hill, the fire was impossible to miss. Flames were rising from the vehicle, bright enough to light the road around it. The whole car looked like it was fully involved, not just smoking from the engine. It sat in the center of the street like someone had abandoned it there and set it on fire. We could see emergency lights in the distance, and it was clear that the main road through town had been closed. At that point, the night began to feel completely wrong. The driver turned onto the road that passed by the baseball field and the high school. That route went around part of town and would let us avoid the burning car. We had all used it many times. But when we got there, we found another white and orange barricade blocking the road. It looked exactly like the one at the mountain. Again, there were no workers standing near it and no clear sign explaining what had happened. It was just a simple municipal barricade across the road. We had already seen one road blocked in the valley, and now another route was closed in town. The driver stopped, cursed, and turned the car around. We headed back up the hill to find another way through. As we reached the top, several fire trucks came rushing in from the direction of the next town. Their sirens echoed through the night, and their emergency lights flashed against the houses and trees. It seemed like an unusually large response for a single car fire. A car could burn badly, of course, but the number of trucks coming from outside the town made it feel like something bigger was happening. We tried another road around the opposite side of town. That was when we saw a house on fire. The flames were visible above the roof. Smoke drifted into the dark sky, and more emergency vehicles were moving in that direction. Now we understood why fire trucks were arriving from another town. There were at least two serious fires burning at the same time, the car in the middle of Main Street and the house on the other side of town. No one in our car was joking anymore. We were confused and a little scared. First, dozens of orange lights had appeared over the mountain in a twisting pattern. Then they had all gone dark at the same moment. The road toward the mountain was blocked. Unmarked-looking vehicles had passed us heading that way. Now roads in town were closed. A car was burning in the middle of the street. A house was on fire, and emergency crews were arriving from other towns. We kept trying to get around, but the fires and barricades made the normal routes impossible. Finally, we had to leave town the same way we had entered. From there, we drove up toward a tiny patch town on top of another mountain and used a completely different highway to circle back around. What should have been a simple drive through town turned into a long detour. By then, we were tired, more sober, and desperate to understand what had happened. Eventually, we returned to the parking lot where we usually sat after our rides. It was one of our normal meeting places, somewhere we could park without drawing too much attention. We shut off the engine and sat there talking about the night. The first explanation we considered was space debris. Maybe something had broken apart while falling through the atmosphere. Pieces of a satellite or rocket could have created orange lights in the sky. If some of that debris reached the ground, perhaps it could have started the fires. That theory seemed possible for a few minutes, but it created more questions. Why had the lights moved in such a perfect corkscrew pattern? Why did they seem to twist around one another in pairs? Why did they all disappear at the same time instead of burning out separately? And if something had fallen, why was the road to the mountain already blocked? Someone suggested a military operation. Maybe the lights were flares or aircraft performing some kind of test. The white cars and black SUV could have belonged to government workers. The barricades might have been there to keep people away from the area. But there were no military bases nearby that we knew about, and the lights still did not behave like anything we had ever seen. The most normal explanation we could come up with involved Chinese lanterns. Maybe there had been a wedding, festival, or private gathering on the other side of the mountain. People could have released dozens of paper lanterns into the sky. From far away, they would look like small orange lights. Wind currents might have carried them upward and caused them to move in unusual ways. It was possible, but I could not imagine wind creating the pattern we had seen. The lights had not drifted loosely or spread apart. They had moved together. They twisted in pairs, like strands winding around each other, while the whole formation rose in a larger spiral. It looked organized. It looked intentional. Then every single light vanished in the same instant. Lanterns would not all go out together like that. The fires might have been unrelated. Cars catch fire. Houses catch fire. Unmarked police-style cars travel on rural roads. Town workers place barricades for many reasons. It was possible that we had simply witnessed several separate events on the same night and connected them because the lights had already frightened us. That is still the most reasonable explanation. But even now, I do not fully believe it. The timing was too strange. The roadblock appeared exactly where we would have started climbing toward the lights. The white cars and black SUV were heading in that direction after we turned back. The town had multiple fires and blocked roads when we returned. Everything happened close together, within one night. And every new detail made the first event feel more suspicious. I have replayed the sight of those orange lights many times. Memory can change over the years, and I know details sometimes become less reliable. But I clearly remember the feeling inside the car when the first light became many. I remember how everyone stopped talking. I remember the twisting pattern and how unnatural it looked. Most of all, I remember the moment they disappeared. There was no fading and no gradual ending. The entire formation turned off at once. None of us ever found out what happened. We did not see anything in the local news that explained the lights. The fires may have been reported separately, but I do not remember hearing anything that connected them. No one came forward to say there had been a festival or lantern release. There was no public explanation for the roadblock near the mountain. Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe the orange lights were lanterns, the government-looking vehicles were normal cars, the barricades were for road work, and the fires had nothing to do with any of it. That answer is possible, and probably easier to accept. But I still think about how strange that night felt from beginning to end. We left town expecting another ordinary valley ride. We planned to drink, listen to music, and waste a few hours driving through empty roads. Instead, we watched dozens of orange lights rise over a mountain in a pattern that looked almost designed. We tried to follow them and found the road blocked. We turned back and passed vehicles that appeared to be heading toward the same area. Then we returned to a town filled with fire trucks, blocked streets, a burning car, and a burning house. Nothing that happened was impossible by itself. It was the way everything happened together that made it feel different. It felt like we had accidentally driven close to something we were not supposed to see. Maybe there was an ordinary explanation hidden behind it all. Maybe there was some event, accident, or operation that never became public. Or maybe the separate events truly had no connection at all. I only know that I have never seen lights move that way before or since. We went on many more valley rides after that, but none of them felt the same. Whenever we drove near that mountain, I looked toward the ridge and waited to see another orange light appear. It never did. The road was open again. The town returned to normal, and the whole thing slowly became one of those stories we told when we wanted to remember how strange our teenage years could be. Still, every time I picture that giant twisting shape rising above the mountain, I feel the same uneasy curiosity I felt that night. Part of me wishes we had moved the barricade and gone over the mountain. Another part of me is glad we turned around. Whatever was happening up there, perhaps we were never meant to find out. About 8 years ago, my brother had an experience on his way home that still makes me feel uneasy whenever I think about it. We lived in a suburb of Houston, Texas, so this did not happen on some isolated country road surrounded by empty fields and deep woods. The area was developed. There were neighborhoods, schools, streetlights, sidewalks, fences, and houses not far from the road. Even late at night, it was the kind of place where you might see another car passing, a porch light left on, or someone coming home from a late shift. That is one of the reasons the story has always bothered me. Strange things are easier to dismiss when they happen far away from people, but this happened in an ordinary suburban area where families lived and children went to school. My brother had been out drinking with some friends that night. I do not know exactly how much he drank, and that detail is important because it gave all of us an easy reason to doubt what he later claimed to see. He had stayed out late, and by the time he started driving home, it was around 3 in the morning. The roads were mostly empty by then. The traffic lights continued changing for cars that were not there, and the streets had that strange nighttime feeling where familiar places suddenly look abandoned. He was only a few minutes away from home when he noticed something in the middle of the road. At first, it looked like a very large person crouched or hunched over. From a distance, he could not clearly make out the shape. It was dark, and his headlights were the main source of light directly ahead of him. The figure was low to the ground, with its body bent forward in an unnatural position. His first thought was that it might be a homeless man. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. Maybe someone was injured, drunk, or sick and had wandered into the road. Perhaps the person had dropped something and was trying to pick it up. My brother slowed down as he approached, trying to understand what he was looking at. The closer he got, the stranger the figure appeared. It seemed too large. Even while crouched, it looked much bigger than a normal person. Its back rose high above the road, and its limbs seemed long. The headlights should have made it easier to identify, but the shape remained dark and unclear. It did not wave for help or move out of the way. It stayed in the center of the road. My brother continued toward it because there was not much room to pass safely without knowing what it was going to do. His mind was still searching for a normal answer. It could have been someone wearing heavy clothes, a large animal, or even some kind of object that only looked alive from a distance. Then, the figure stood up. My brother said it was massive. It did not rise to the height of an average person. It unfolded from its crouched position and seemed to keep getting taller. Its body stretched upward until it looked much larger than any human being he had ever seen. He could not give an exact measurement because the encounter happened quickly, and he was inside a moving car. But he was certain that it was not a normal-sized person. The sight of it standing in the headlights made him immediately afraid. Then he saw its eyes. They were glowing red. He did not describe them as ordinary eyes reflecting light the way an animal's eyes sometimes do. When headlights hit the eyes of deer, cats, dogs, or raccoons, they can shine in different colors. That is a normal effect, and my brother had seen it before. But he insisted these eyes looked different. They appeared bright red and seemed to glow from within the dark face. The most disturbing part was the way the creature looked at him. My brother said it did not merely turn toward the approaching vehicle. It looked directly at him. There was a windshield, headlights, and the front of the car between them, yet he felt the figure was not interested in the machine. Its gaze seemed fixed on the person behind the steering wheel. It was as if it could see past the glare in the glass and knew exactly where his eyes were. That detail terrified him more than its size. A wild animal caught in the road might stare at headlights because it is confused or frightened. This thing seemed aware. Its attention felt deliberate and personal. For a moment, the two of them watched each other while the car continued moving closer. My brother did not know whether to stop, reverse, or try to drive around it. He was afraid that if he stopped, the figure might approach the car. At the same time, he did not want to hit it or get close enough for it to reach him. Before he could decide what to do, the creature moved. It leaped from the middle of the road. Beside the road was the fenced property of a local elementary school. The fence bordered the street and was high enough that a normal person would have to climb it. According to my brother, the figure did not climb. It jumped. He estimated that it covered around 25 feet, clearing the distance from the road and going over the school fence in a single movement. It landed somewhere inside or beyond the school property and immediately ran away. The movement happened too quickly for him to study it. 1 second, the huge figure was standing in the road and staring directly at him. The next, it had launched itself over the fence and disappeared into the darkness near the school. My brother did not stop to investigate. He pressed the gas and drove home as quickly as he could. Our house was only about 5 minutes away from where he claimed the encounter happened. That short drive must have felt much longer to him. Every dark shape beside the road probably looked like the creature returning. He kept looking in his mirrors, afraid it might be following him. When he finally reached the house, he parked and ran inside. I was asleep at the time, as was my father. The sound of the front door slamming woke both of us. It was loud enough that I immediately knew something unusual had happened. I opened my bedroom door and looked into the hallway. I heard my brother running up the stairs. A few seconds later, he passed me on his way toward his room. He was moving quickly and did not stop to explain himself. The look on his face caught my attention immediately. He looked terrified. His face had lost its normal expression, and his eyes were wide. He looked visibly shaken, like someone who had just escaped a dangerous situation. There were tears in his eyes. That was strange because my brother was not usually the kind of person who came home crying from fear. He was also known for exaggerating and making up stories. He liked joking, lying for entertainment, and telling people things just to see whether they would believe him. He was what I would call a perpetual bullshitter. If he had calmly walked into the house and told me he had seen a giant creature with glowing red eyes, I probably would have laughed and ignored him. But he did not look like he was performing. There was no smile waiting to appear. He was not watching my reaction to see whether the joke worked. He seemed deeply disturbed. I followed him and asked what had happened. At first, he struggled to explain it. His breathing was fast, and he kept looking toward the windows and the staircase as if he expected something to come into the house behind him. Eventually, he told me the whole story. He described the huge figure crouched in the road. He told me that it stood up as his car approached, revealing how massive it was. He described the glowing red eyes and the feeling that it had looked directly at him. Then, he explained how it leaped over the elementary school fence and ran away. I listened, but I did not know what to think. My first reaction was disbelief. He had been drinking. It was 3 in the morning, and darkness can change the appearance of ordinary objects. A person who is tired or intoxicated can misjudge size, distance, and movement. Maybe he had seen a large animal, and his frightened mind turned it into something impossible. There were normal animals in the area. Large dogs, deer, coyotes, and other creatures sometimes wandered near roads. A deer could appear strangely tall when standing suddenly, and its eyes could reflect the headlights. It might also jump over a fence. But the details did not fit perfectly. A deer did not look like a hunched person in the middle of the road. A large dog could not stand up to an impossible height and leap 25 feet over a school fence. Coyotes were much smaller than the figure he described. Maybe it was a man wearing dark clothing. A tall person crouching could look unusually large when illuminated by headlights. If the road sloped or the surrounding shadows confused his sense of distance, the jump may have seemed much farther than it really was. The red eyes could have been reflectors, glasses, or some strange effect caused by the car lights. That explanation was also possible. Still, it did not explain my brother's reaction. He had seen frightening things before. He had been in fights, dangerous situations, and car accidents. He was not someone who easily came home with tears in his eyes. Whatever he saw had shaken him in a way I had never witnessed. I continued, asking questions, partly because I wanted to catch him changing the story. People who lie often add details, remove things, or contradict themselves when asked the same question more than once. His description remained consistent. The creature was crouched in the road. It stood up as he approached. It was extremely large. Its eyes glowed red. It looked directly at him. Then it jumped over the elementary school fence and disappeared. He did not seem excited about telling the story. He did not act proud that he had experienced something unusual. He looked like he wanted to forget it. Even so, I could not fully believe him. He was my brother, and I knew his personality. He had lied to me too many times for me to accept an impossible story without evidence. I told myself that alcohol, exhaustion, and fear had created the experience. For the next few days, I did not think about it much. The story stayed in the back of my mind, but I treated it as something strange my brother had imagined. Then I mentioned it to a friend at work. We were talking casually and telling stories to pass the time. I began explaining what my brother said he had seen. I was not trying to convince her it was real. I probably told it in the same way someone might tell a strange rumor or ghost story. I described the location and the large hunched figure in the road. Before I finished describing it, my friend stopped me. She asked, "Did it have glowing red eyes?" The question immediately changed the mood of the conversation. I had not yet mentioned the eyes. At least I do not remember reaching that part of the story before she asked. She seemed serious, not like she was joking or guessing. I asked why she wanted to know. She told me that her brother had experienced something similar only a few days earlier. He had been driving home from work at night when he saw a strange figure on the same road. His encounter happened about 6 miles away from where my brother saw it, but it was still along the same stretch or connected route. Her brother had also described a large, unnatural-looking figure. He had also noticed glowing red eyes. I felt cold as she spoke. My brother and her brother did not know each other well enough to create the story together. As far as I knew, they had not spoken about the sightings. The encounters had happened within only a few days of each other, on the same road, several miles apart. That coincidence made it much harder to dismiss my brother's story. One intoxicated person seeing something strange at 3 in the morning could easily be explained as a mistake. 2 different people reporting a similar creature in the same area within a short period was different. It did not prove that a giant red-eyed creature existed, but it made the possibility feel more real. I asked my friend for more details. Her brother's experience was not exactly the same, but the main description matched closely enough to disturb me. There had been a large figure near the road. It appeared unnatural, and its eyes seemed to glow red. I began thinking about the distance between the two sightings. 6 miles was not far for a large animal or fast-moving creature. If it was traveling through the area at night, it could easily have appeared in both places over several days. The road passed through suburban neighborhoods, school zones, and developed areas, but there were also drainage areas, wooded spaces, fields, and empty properties nearby. A creature could possibly move between those places while remaining hidden during the day. I also thought about the elementary school. The idea of something so large entering school property in the middle of the night was deeply unsettling. During the day, children played behind that fence. Parents dropped them off, teachers walked between buildings, and the grounds looked completely normal. At 3 in the morning, according to my brother, a massive figure with red eyes jumped over the fence and disappeared inside. I wondered where it went after that. Did it cross the school grounds and continue into another neighborhood? Did it hide near one of the buildings? Was it still there when employees arrived in the morning? Maybe it was only passing through, avoiding the headlights and looking for a dark route away from the road. That would make sense if it were an animal. But what kind of animal looked directly at a driver with glowing red eyes and then cleared a fence in a single giant leap? Over the years, I have considered many explanations. The most likely is that both men saw an animal they could not identify clearly. Darkness, headlights, speed, and fear can distort the way something looks. The brain often fills in missing details, especially when a person sees an unexpected shape for only a few seconds. A large deer could stand in the road and leap over a fence. Deer eyes can reflect light, although they do not usually appear bright red in the way my brother described. From the front, a deer lowering its head might look hunched. When it raised its body and jumped, the movement could seem much larger than it really was. Maybe both brothers saw the same unusually large deer. A wild hog was another possibility. Feral hogs can become extremely large and have strange shapes when seen in darkness. But they are not known for standing upright or jumping over high fences. A person could also have been involved. Perhaps someone was wearing unusual clothing, a costume, or equipment with red lights. A criminal or prankster might have tried to frighten passing drivers. But no normal person could jump the distance my brother described. Of course, his estimate might have been wrong. He was terrified, moving in a car, and possibly intoxicated. The creature may have jumped only a few feet over a lower section of fence, while fear made it seem much more impressive. That is a reasonable explanation. It still does not account for the second sighting. The fact that my friend mentioned the red eyes before I told her about them remains the most disturbing part for me. She had no reason to invent that detail. Her brother had apparently told her his own story before hearing anything about mine. Maybe rumors were already circulating in the neighborhood. Someone could have started talking about a red-eyed creature, and both men unconsciously shaped ordinary sightings around the same idea. Stories spread quickly, especially in small social groups. But my brother had not heard any such rumor as far as I knew. He came home frightened before we knew anyone else had seen it. Sometimes I wonder whether there are animals living around cities that people rarely notice. Urban and suburban areas hide more wildlife than most residents realize. Creatures move through drainage channels, green belts, empty lots, and wooded strips between neighborhoods. Most come out at night when people are sleeping. A sick, injured, or unusually large animal might look almost supernatural under the right conditions. Its fur could be missing, changing the shape of its body. Disease could affect its movement. The red eyes could be reflected headlights. That explanation makes the most sense, and it is the one I try to believe. But it does not remove the feeling I get when I remember my brother's face. He looked like someone who had seen something impossible. The tears in his eyes were real. His hands shook. He ran inside and slammed the door hard enough to wake the house. He did not stand in the driveway laughing about how scared he had been. He acted as though something might have followed him home. Our house was only 5 minutes from the sighting. If the creature could leap that far and run as fast as he claimed, 5 minutes did not seem like much distance. Perhaps that was why he hurried upstairs and closed himself in his room. He may have thought the creature knew where he was going. He had said it looked directly at him. Not at the car, at him. Even now, that thought bothers me. What if it remembered his face? What if it watched the car leave and followed the road toward our neighborhood? Nothing else happened at our house that night. There were no scratches on the doors, no movement in the yard, and no glowing eyes outside the windows. By morning, everything seemed normal. The creature was never seen by our family again. Still, the story stayed with me. Whenever I drove along that road late at night, I found myself looking toward the school fence and the dark spaces beyond it. I checked the middle of the road more carefully, especially near the place where my brother said the figure had been crouching. I never saw anything unusual. That should have made me feel better, but sometimes it made the encounter seem even stranger. Whatever he saw appeared once and disappeared, leaving no evidence behind. To this day, thinking about the story brings an uncontrollable feeling of dread over me. It is not only ordinary fear. Sometimes my eyes begin watering when I remember it, almost like my body reacts before my mind can stop it. I do not completely understand why. I did not see the creature myself. I only heard the story. Yet the idea of it standing in the middle of a familiar road feels deeply wrong. A massive figure was crouched under the streetlights while the neighborhood slept. When a car approached, it stood, looked directly at the driver, and then crossed an impossible distance in one leap. Then, days later, someone else reported seeing something similar miles away on the same road. Maybe my brother was drunk and confused. Maybe my friend's brother saw an ordinary animal and described it in a similar way. Maybe the matching red eyes were a coincidence. Those explanations are possible. But whenever I picture my brother running into the house with tears in his eyes, I find it difficult to believe he saw something ordinary. He had spent years lying, joking, and making up stories. That night was different. He was not trying to make us believe him. He was trying to convince himself that he had made it home safely. Even after 8 years, the story still gives me chills. Sometimes, without warning, I remember the creature rising from the road and fixing its red eyes on my brother through the windshield. I think about it leaping over the school fence and disappearing into the darkness. Then I remember my friend stopping me before I could finish the story. Did it have glowing red eyes? That question was the moment the story stopped feeling like one frightened man's imagination, and it became something I have never been able to explain.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.